Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video 178, the new age of Hippiedom, you know, the late 60s, early 70s, some of the spirituality we see there, relatively recent times, generally speaking, at least in the span of human history, is actually astonishingly similar to a lot of stuff from Victorian occultism. I've made this statement before, I think it was when I was talking to Nick Fuentes. I said, you know, your parents probably never did like black magic or anything, but your grandparents and certainly great-grandparents probably did. There was a wide sweeping familiarity. We're talking the late 1800s, 1880s, and 90s usually. You get a rising literacy in the Western population, a lot of exploration in colonial lands. You've got a lot of Eastern thought entering the Western lexicon in somewhat authentic form, variously authentic or less so. Now, you've got all of these things. From that period roughly through the 1920s. After that, in the Depression era, it sort of peters out into fire and brimstone land. Really a lot of Protestant evangelism. And then, of course, in and after World War II, a lot of that stuff dies down until the hippie movement briefly flourishes, dies down again, kind of makes a resurgence during the Satanic Panic era, although that's really just connected to Hippiedom. That's really, as the hippies started using heroin, I suppose, and then disappears again until the modern occult renaissance, which really is the late 90s through early 2000s into now, as all of these old texts become available to the world. They're being transcribed and translated on a day-to-day basis. I'm part of that. I'm trying to release paperback variants that are inexpensive but also proper, as opposed to some of the earlier efforts that are, you know, cheaply scanned, or they're, you know, $25 for a 10-page article. Seems a little bit steep. But I've noticed in editing sort of the Victorian era of literature, a lot of DeLawrence works especially, there's a huge number of things there that seem awfully similar to what the hippies were saying. Love beads and meditation sort of stuff. Literally, the concept of vibrations. I'm editing a work right now on hypnosis by DeLawrence, L.W. DeLawrence. And it explicitly mentions everything regarding all of this hippiedom that we see. Good vibrations, meditating, sort of the negative control of people's minds if they ruminate on, you know, things of negative character. You'd think war or something. It's literally all there. Several sections of this work compiled together would form a pretty good John Lennon-esque late 60s manifesto of sorts, I'm sure. It'd be the sort of thing that you would think of Yoko Ono probably reading as a bedtime story, something like that. And I was actually surprised, because usually when we think of that era of time, up through until the Roaring 20s, that roughly 30-year period, we think of people that are overdressed, understimulated in a sexual sense. It's very taboo to talk about sexuality, and yet then, you know, behold the phallic works, you know, literally a dozen works on penis worship released around this, again, the 1890s. It must have been quite a parlor conversation for the church wives, because, oh, well, this is scientific, so all these inscriptions of, you know, cocks, basically, it's okay because it's anthropology. It's this primitive stuff, but it's scientific, so it's all right. It's sort of how they, you know, the Kama Sutra, English edition, 1880s, that's sort of how they got around it. But don't let people fool you. I have a feeling, based on what I read in these works, people were considerably less moralistic, less religious, and less given over to maybe the Victorian era of superstition than we think. Now, in the sense of like, oh, you know, beating off will cause, you know, mental illness or something. I think that was less prevalent than looking at these things through a very paganized lens, in fact. Based on my reading of these works, a lot of these, for the time, were very scientific. They were academic in nature. The DeLawrence works aren't meant to just be, you know, here's spooky, dooky, mumbo-jumbo nonsense. They were quasi-scientific. I've edited and read other works that are strictly scientific. They're strictly academic works, annotated and everything. Full bibliography, probably got reviewed by actual scientists, mainstream scientists at the time. And they mention these things. They talk about all these weird sort of spiritual systems. They talk about the literal existence of vibrations, and involved with telepathy especially. Maybe not love beads, but certainly Hindu magic mirrors and crystal orbs and things of that nature. Meditation being both useful and spiritually enlightening, compatible, by the way, with Christendom. In the 1960s, when the drug-friendly hippies started talking about meditation, it was frowned upon by the fire and brimstone crowd. However, half a century before, when the Victorian crowd was saying basically the same thing without using drugs, it was considered okay. You can read works, Hartman and some of these others, they wrote little tracts that are somewhat similar to modern sort of extra-canonical Christian opinion writings. Literally, part of the eugenics movement was aimed towards perfecting prayer. That is, literally prescribing very legalistic, almost incantation-style prayers to cure disease or to prevent various maladies. And it's very much like in the grimoire tradition, maybe a century before, you have works that do the same thing to secure love. But then the Christians at the time were writing the same thing. Literally, I've reviewed works from the mid-1700s, the Enlightenment period especially, was in tune with the concept of astrology, like comets and constellations, even UFO lore. They started talking about the possibility of life on other planets. It seems the general consensus was it existed, and that it probably was intelligent, and that hopefully they found Jesus or something. That seems to be the general consensus. In the Victorian era, it switches around towards sort of the psychic side. It lays the groundwork for a lot of the New Agery and Hippiedom that actually itself lays the groundwork for a lot of the stuff you see now. Some of the spooky woo side of even the dark occultists. It's really taking it like Quetting. He openly invokes Hinduism within his works. Well, why is it that Westerners would even be involved with that kind of spiritual lore? I can read, works from the Victorian era 100 years ago, and they say basically the same thing. It's actually extremely interesting. I strongly recommend people study at least the spiritual side of literary history. It's fascinating, actually, to see sort of the evolution of these spiritual systems. But I just thought that was an interesting, a shorter topic than usual, but yeah, it's something that needs to be said. Because a lot of times people, I think, assume that the further back you go, the more moralistic and religious people were. That's actually totally not the case. People in the Victorian era were weird. They're probably having orgies and weird stuff like that. They certainly, not long before that, we have open allusions to premarital and extramarital sex going on within spiritual literature, and it's spoken of, it's not taboo, it's spoken of openly, number one, in veiled language, like, the rituals of Hymen, finding Cupid, or something like that, but it's clear what they're talking about. Number one, the nuptial vows. Number two, it's apparently, they're openly admitting it's done for enjoyment, and that a lot of people do enjoy it, and they're talking about, if you have a mole on this part of your body, you might become a whore. It's spoken of as though it's no big deal, basically. It's sort of not the stuff you get from the Depression until the hippie era, certainly. I just thought that was a fascinating little aside into sort of my literary adventures. That's about all. Peace out.